The warden just stared, his mouth hanging open in utter disbelief, his face a pale mask of shock. He was witnessing the complete and total annihilation of a criminal dynasty, an empire built on 2 decades of suffocating fear, meticulously dismantled in the span of a single afternoon. It didn't happen with the brute force of a riot squad or a violent uprising. It happened with a whisper, a series of calculated moves so subtle, so precise, that no one saw the checkmate until the king had already fallen. And the entire chain of events was set in motion by one singular, public act of degradation, aimed at me, the one person they thought was just another uniform, another cog in the machine. They had no idea who they were dealing with, no concept of the person behind the badge. Before I continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, and leave your like. It helps a lot. My name is Elena Rostova. I am 45 years old, and for the past 2 decades, I have walked the cold, echoing tiers of Blackwood Correctional Facility. This place has a taste, a permanent flavor of stale regret, industrial disinfectant, and the faint metallic tang of despair that never washes away. Most people who take this job see themselves as monster managers. I never did. I saw it as managing men. Broken men, violent men, men who had thrown their lives away, certainly, but men nonetheless. My philosophy was forged in the crucible of necessity, especially as a woman in this overwhelmingly male world. Be unbreakably firm, be impeccably fair, and above all, listen. You learn more from what is whispered in the shadows than from what is shouted in the yard. My entire strategy was built on being predictable, on being a fixed point in their chaotic world. Respect isn't given freely here, it's earned through consistency. They knew that with Officer Rostova, the rules were as solid and unforgiving as the concrete walls around them. I didn't play favorites. I didn't bend. That unflinching consistency became my armor and my authority. In a place where everyone is constantly looking for an angle, for a weakness to exploit, the greatest weapon you have isn't a baton or pepper spray. It's the certainty that you will do exactly what you said you would do. A man who knows exactly where he stands is a man less likely to stumble into trouble. This approach granted me a quiet, almost invisible authority. I was not feared in the way a predator is feared. I was respected in the way a force of nature is respected. And that included Marcus Thorne. If Blackwood had a king, Marcus wore the crown. His power wasn't in his fists or his size, it was in his mind. He possessed a lethal charisma, a serpent smile, and eyes that didn't just look at you, they scanned you, cataloging every insecurity, every hidden debt, every secret shame you held. He was the ghost in the machine, running all the contraband, the gambling rings, and an information network so vast and efficient it would make a government agency blush. He orchestrated everything with a chilling, detached precision, never allowing his own hands to get dirty. He was a master of delegating risk while hoarding all the rewards. Countless new guards, eager and ambitious, had tried to make their careers by taking down the king. They all failed, spectacularly. They would tear his cell apart and find nothing but a Bible and a copy of War and Peace. They would try to flip one of his lieutenants, and that man would invariably have a tragic accident in the laundry room the next day. Marcus was a phantom, insulated by thick layers of fear and a twisted, desperate loyalty he had cultivated over 20 years. The warden, a man named Connolly whose greatest love was the neat finality of paperwork, knew everything about Marcus. We all did. But as long as Marcus kept the simmering violence from boiling over into a full-blown riot that would attract the state's attention and threaten his cushy position, Connolly was content to let the prison manage itself. It was a lazy, negligent, and profoundly dangerous philosophy. It treated Blackwood like a holding tank for society's problems, allowing men like Marcus Thorne to fester and grow, building their dark kingdoms in the shadows cast by institutional indifference. For 20 years, I never confronted Marcus directly. It wasn't my way. My method was erosion, not explosion. If I discovered contraband during a search, I confiscated it and filed a report, regardless of who it belonged to. If I overheard whispers of an extortion plot, I would silently arrange for the target to be moved to a different cell block for his own protection. I was a janitor of human misery, quietly mopping up the messes Marcus and his ilk left in their wake. I treated him with the exact same professional detachment I afforded a first-time shoplifter serving a 6-month sentence. He was inmate Thorne. He received direct, unambiguous orders. I never once engaged with his charming banter, which I knew for what it was, a constant, probing search for a crack in my armor. For 2 decades, our unspoken truce held. He saw me as part of the prison's unchangeable landscape, a dull, predictable feature of his world. I was an obstacle, yes, but a manageable one. He thought I was simple, a clock-punching guard with no ambition beyond collecting her pension. He misread me so completely it was almost laughable. He saw my lack of overt aggression as weakness, never realizing it was a calculated strategy. He mistook my quiet for silence. And that single, arrogant miscalculation was the mistake that would unravel his entire world. Because while he was busy building an empire of fear, I was building something far more powerful and enduring, an encyclopedic, granular knowledge of the very system he was exploiting and of the men he was using to do it. I just hadn't been given a reason to burn his kingdom to the ground. Until now. The day my world fractured and was reborn began like any other. The morning count was clean. Breakfast was the usual cacophony of clanging metal trays and the low, guttural murmur of 1,000 private conversations. I was on my standard rounds in C Block, which was, for all intents and purposes, the capital of Marcus Thorne's kingdom. But the air that morning was different. It was heavy, thick with an electric buzz of anticipation that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The inmates, usually a drab sea of sullen, bored faces, were all watching me. Not just glancing, but watching me, their eyes following my every step, sharing a collective, knowing smirk. It was the deeply unsettling feeling of being the star of a play you didn't know you were in, just moments before the curtain rises. I paused by the cell of a new arrival, a terrified kid named Peterson, barely 20 years old and in on a simple possession charge. He was trying, and failing, to make himself invisible. Marcus's crew had been circling him like vultures since the day he arrived. I gave him a brief, firm nod. Keep your head down, Peterson. Stay out of the yard politics. Focus on your time and nothing else. As I turned away, Marcus's voice, smooth as poisoned honey, drifted from his cell down the tier. That's excellent advice, Officer Rostova. Especially that part about staying out of politics. A low ripple of stifled laughter echoed down the block. I kept my face a mask of indifference and continued my patrol. Rule number 1 in Blackwood. Never, ever let them see they've gotten to you. But it was too late. The show had already begun, and I was the main attraction. The climax took place in the Chow Hall, the most public, most unforgiving stage in the entire prison. Every inmate, every guard on duty, everyone was there. I was stationed near the kitchens, a routine post, observing the long serving line. Everything appeared normal, until one of Marcus's primary enforcers, a hulking brute named Riggs, accidentally stumbled as he walked past me. His entire tray, greasy chili, mashed potatoes, and a carton of milk, arced through the air. All over me. It was a childish, almost pathetic gesture. But the execution was flawless theater. Hot, sticky food dripped from my hair down the front of my clean, pressed uniform. The chili stained the fabric a deep, ugly brown. For a single stretched-out second, there was a collective gasp, and then a profound, chilling silence descended upon the hall. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed on me. Waiting. Judging. My training, my every instinct, screamed at me. Maintain composure, file a report, haul Riggs to solitary confinement, follow protocol. But this was never about protocol. This was a performance. This was about power. Before I could even process my next move, Marcus rose from his table. The silence in the hall became absolute. He strolled toward me, a look of faux concern artfully painted on his face. "Oh, Officer Rostova, what a terrible, clumsy accident. Here, let us help you with that." And then it happened. It wasn't a punch or a shove. It was infinitely worse. 2 of his other men materialized, holding buckets of sludgy, gray mop water and filthy rags, obviously prepared and waiting for this very moment. They didn't just wipe the food off. They scrubbed me. They made a grand, humiliating spectacle of it, dabbing at my uniform with stinking, dripping sponges, their movements agonizingly slow and demeaning. "Gotta get this spot right here," one of them snickered, dragging a grime-streaked rag across the pristine badge on my chest. "Can't have our favorite officer looking anything less than perfect." I stood there, a statue carved from ice, every muscle in my body screaming to put these men on the floor. But I was surrounded, cut off. Any physical move I made would be an assault, a loss of control. I would be the one in the wrong. My fellow officers stood on the far side of the room, trapped behind a wall of 100 inmates, their faces a mixture of impotent fury and stunned disbelief. They were helpless, and Marcus knew it. He had brilliantly weaponized the very rules I lived by against me. The final, sharpest blade of humiliation was delivered by Marcus himself. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for me, while he gestured magnanimously to the silent, watching crowd. "You see, Elena," he murmured, using my first name for the first time in 20 years, a deliberate, calculated move to strip me of my title, my rank, my very identity. "You think this uniform gives you power. In here, it's just a costume. And right now, you're the entertainment." He delicately plucked a piece of soggy bread from my shoulder, held it up for the entire room to see, and then contemptuously flicked it to the floor. "You're a joke," he whispered, his eyes glittering with triumph. Then he turned to the packed hall and boomed, "All right, everyone, show's over. Let the woman get back to her duties." The chow hall erupted. It wasn't just laughter, it was a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated disrespect. It was a primal roar of mockery. Jeers, catcalls, men banging their cups on the tables in a deafening, rhythmic taunt. I stood there, drenched in filth and shame, the sound washing over me like a physical blow. 20 years of carefully constructed respect, shattered in less than a minute. I could see it in the eyes of the other inmates, the ones who used to offer a respectful nod. Now, they either looked away in shame or, worse, they smirked. I wasn't Officer Rostova anymore. I was a target. I was a punchline. I turned and walked out of that chow hall, my boots squishing with every step. I did not run. I walked with my back ramrod straight, my head held high, even as the foundations of my world crumbled beneath me. The tsunami of laughter followed me all the way down the corridor. They all thought they had broken me. Marcus was certain he had won. But as their mocking cheers echoed off the cold concrete, a profound glacial calm settled deep in my soul. This was not the end. This was the beginning. They had just declared war, but they had absolutely no idea what kind of weapons I was about to unleash. In the weeks that followed, I perfected the art of becoming a ghost. I was physically present, a body moving through the required motions, but the person they knew as Elena Rostova was gone. I arrived for every shift precisely on time, my uniform immaculate, my boots polished to a reflective shine. I walked the tiers, conducted the counts, supervised yard time. But the woman doing those things was a hollow shell, an automaton. The inmates saw it. The other guards saw it. And Warden Connolly, to his mounting unease, definitely saw it. The taunts were no longer whispered, they were shouted, bold and brazen, across the yard. "Hey, Rostova, need a napkin? Watch your step, officer. Wouldn't want to slip on some chili." They gave me a nickname, Sloppy Elena. The name spread like a virus, sticking to my reputation like mud. Even the newest inmates, the ones who should have had a healthy dose of fear in their eyes, now just looked at me with open contempt. In the brutal, unforgiving hierarchy of prison life, I had been cast down to the very bottom. I was no longer a guard, I was prey. My colleagues, my friends, tried to rally around me. My partner, Dave, a good man with a righteous temper, offered to have my back, to take a few of Marcus's men aside for a private conversation. "We can't let him get away with this, Elena," he'd grind out, his jaw clenched in frustration. "He made all of us look like fools." I would just shake my head, my voice devoid of all emotion. "Let it go, Dave. It's finished." They all thought I had surrendered, that Marcus had shattered my spirit. The warden summoned me to his office, a room that perpetually smelled of stale coffee and low-grade panic. My public humiliation had become an administrative inconvenience, a problem that might generate paperwork, and Connolly despised problems. "Rostova," he began, avoiding my eyes as he shuffled files on his desk. "I hear there's been some friction on C Block. It sounds as though your authority has been seriously compromised." "Yes, sir," I stated, my voice perfectly flat. "And what do you intend to do about it?" he asked, finally looking up, searching my face for the outrage, the anger, the demand for action he expected. He found nothing but a placid emptiness. "My job, sir," I replied. I'm going to continue doing my job." He heaved a sigh, a mixture of disappointment and relief. "Look, Elena. I can move you. Put you on the night shift, transfer you to the minimum security wing. Give things a chance to cool down." It was a lifeline, an escape from the daily gauntlet of ridicule. But taking it would be an admission of defeat. It would be handing Marcus a declared victory. "No, thank you, Warden," I said, my voice unwavering. "I'll stay on C block." Connolly stared at me as if I had lost my mind. "Suit yourself, Rostova. But if this situation escalates, it's your career on the line." He didn't understand. My career was already dead. The officer Rostova they all knew had died on the floor of that chow hall. Someone new was standing in her place. Someone they couldn't see. And so I watched. While they jeered at me, I listened. While they mocked my presence, I observed. I allowed myself to fade into the prison's background, becoming as inanimate as the steel bars and concrete floors. They wanted me to be a joke, so I became a ghost. I absorbed the insults with a blank, unblinking stare. I never reacted. I never engaged. I became completely, utterly boring. And when you become boring, people stop paying attention to you. They begin to talk around you, through you, as if you aren't even there. That is when I began to see the hairline fractures in Marcus Thorne's monolithic empire. I saw the raw, primal terror in the Kid Peterson's eyes whenever one of Marcus's thugs cornered him in the laundry room. I saw the tiny folded pieces of paper, kites, being discreetly passed from hand to hand. I noticed how Marcus's top enforcer, Riggs, always looked haunted and pale after his weekly video calls with his family. I saw how a rival gang leader on B Block watched Marcus with the hungry eyes of a wolf, just waiting, patiently, for the first sign of weakness. They all looked at me and saw a broken woman, a defeated guard just staring into the middle distance, counting the minutes until her shift ended. They had no idea they were looking at a predator mapping out every inch of the battlefield. Every sneer, every whispered threat, every nervous glance was a piece of a puzzle I was assembling in the quiet of my mind. Marcus wasn't just running contraband. He was operating a massive, sophisticated extortion racket. The kites contained names and phone numbers. The targets were always the new, terrified inmates like Peterson. Marcus would get information on their families, where their wives worked, where their children went to school. Then, he would use associates on the outside to call those families and demand exorbitant payments for their loved ones' continued protection and safety inside. It was a brilliant, terrifyingly effective, and seemingly untouchable operation. The inmates were too petrified to talk, and their families were too petrified not to pay. And then, I found it. The linchpin. The single weak point holding the entire monstrous machine together, Riggs. The mountain of a man who had initiated my public downfall. He was the enforcer, the one gathering the information from the inside. But his son, on the outside, was desperately ill. The medical bills were burying his family alive. Marcus was giving Riggs a larger cut of the profits, but it was a drop in the ocean compared to what he needed. Riggs wasn't just loyal to Marcus. He was trapped by him. He was a desperate man. And a desperate man is a predictable one. They had made me invisible. And in their world of shadows and secrets, being invisible was the most powerful weapon of all. If you're still here with me, don't forget to subscribe, activate notifications, leave your like, and share this video with someone. Section 4. My counteroffensive did not begin with a raid or a confrontation. It began with a whisper and a meticulously planned file transfer. For weeks, I had done nothing but watch, listen, and absorb. Now, it was time to act. My first move was to surgically sever the nervous system of Marcus's empire, his information network. He used the prison library, a quiet, overlooked space I supervised twice a week, as his personal post office. Coded messages were left for him inside specific books. I had been watching the system operate for years, documenting every detail. A dog-eared page 47 in the Count of Monte Cristo meant a new potential target had arrived. A lightly underlined passage in a tattered law textbook signaled that a payment had been successfully extorted on the outside. One Tuesday afternoon, I made my move. I knew from the duty roster that a surprise, full-scale shakedown of C Block was scheduled for the following morning. I was going to use the institution's own machinery against its shadow ruler. While the few inmates in the library were browsing, I calmly walked the stacks and collected the 7 books Marcus used as dead drops. I didn't confiscate them, that would be too obvious. Instead, I replaced them with identical, pristine copies I had ordered and paid for out of my own pocket weeks before. The original marked-up books went into a box labeled "Damaged for Recycling." Then, while doing my routine closing inspection, I discovered a small, crudely sharpened piece of metal tucked inside a different book. I reported it immediately, as procedure demanded. The result was instantaneous. Warden Connolly, spooked by the weapon, shut the library down for a 72-hour security review, precisely during the window when Marcus was expecting his weekly reports. His lines of communication were severed. It was a minor disruption, but it was the first seed of chaos. My second move was aimed directly at the heart of his enforcer, Riggs. I knew his son's illness was his breaking point. I couldn't offer him a reduced sentence or legal immunity. But I could offer him something far more valuable. I found him in a quiet corner of the yard, deliberately away from the watchful eyes of Marcus's crew. I didn't mention the extortion racket. I didn't threaten him. I approached him not as a guard to a prisoner, but as one human being to another. "Riggs," I said, my voice low and even, "I heard about your son. The hospital he's at is fine. But the oncology specialists at St. Jude's, they've just opened up a new experimental trial. For his specific, rare condition." He flinched, his massive shoulders tensing. He stared at me, his eyes a mixture of suspicion and fear. "How in the hell do you know about my son?" "I hear things," I replied simply, letting the ambiguity hang in the air. "This program is fully funded by a private foundation. They cover everything, travel for your wife, lodging, every single medical expense. But the waiting list is years long. It's virtually impossible to get into." I let that sink in, watching the flicker of desperate hope fight against a lifetime of cynicism in his eyes. Then I leaned in slightly. "My sister-in-law is the head of admissions for that program. One phone call, Riggs. That's all it would take. A spot could open up." He just stared, the tough guy facade he had worn for years completely disintegrating, revealing the terrified father underneath. What do you want from me?" he stammered. "I don't want anything," I said, and this was the most crucial part of the entire strategy. "I am not asking you to become an informant. I don't want you to testify. I don't want you to say a single word against Thorne. I just want you to listen to me. Marcus is going down. A storm is coming for him. The only question is whether you go down with him. You're a good father, Riggs. Don't let that man be the reason you never see your son again." I turned and walked away without another word, leaving him standing there, his entire world tilting on its axis. I hadn't asked him for a thing. I had simply given him a choice, his king or his son. The seed of doubt had been planted in fertile, desperate soil. The final piece of the puzzle was the most delicate. I had to expose Marcus's entire operation from the outside, ensuring it could never be traced back to me. In Blackwood, being labeled a snitch is a death sentence, no matter what uniform you wear. I had to make the system devour itself. I composed an anonymous letter. Not to Warden Connolly, who I knew would bury it to avoid the headache. I sent it directly to the notoriously unyielding head of the State Department of Corrections. On my day off, I drove 2 towns over and mailed it from a random post office box. The letter itself was a masterpiece of bureaucratic subtlety. It didn't make wild accusations. It simply raised procedural concerns about potential financial misconduct linked to the third-party vendor that managed inmate trust accounts and video calls, specifically for C-Block. It suggested a routine audit, cross-referencing inmate call times with a pattern of suspicious money transfers to the accounts of known associates of certain high-influence inmates. I never once used Marcus's name, but I laid out the breadcrumbs, dates, transaction patterns, and account numbers I had painstakingly memorized, so perfectly that any competent financial investigator would see a giant, blinking red arrow pointing directly at him and his entire network. The dominoes were all perfectly aligned. The library shutdown had plunged his internal communications into disarray. My conversation with Riggs had fractured the loyalty of his most important lieutenant. And the anonymous letter had just dispatched a team of incorruptible, outside investigators on a direct path to his throne. All I had to do now was wait for them to fall. Section 5. The end came with a swift and silent finality that was almost poetic. Less than a week after I mailed the letter, a team of auditors from the state capitol arrived unannounced. These weren't guards who could be intimidated or prison administrators who could be bought. They were quiet, serious people in suits who moved with an unshakable authority that Marcus's prison yard power could not touch. They bypassed the warden's office, went straight to the administration building, requisitioned all financial records pertaining to C Block, and sealed themselves inside a conference room. Warden Connolly was in a full-blown panic. This was completely beyond his control, an outside force he couldn't influence or understand. He had no idea where the attack had come from. The first domino to fall was Riggs. The auditors, meticulously following the trail I had laid for them, immediately flagged his family's bank account for receiving a series of large weekly payments that lined up perfectly with his video call schedule. They brought him in for questioning. Trapped between federal fraud charges and the image of his dying son, with my offer of a lifeline echoing in his mind, he broke. But he was smart. He didn't confess to being a willing part of an extortion ring. He painted himself as a victim, claiming Marcus had been forcing him to accept loans, and that he was terrified for his family's safety if he refused. And then he gave them everything. Every name, every date, every hidden detail of the operation. With Riggs's sworn statement, the auditors had more than enough. They descended upon Marcus Thorne not as a prison kingpin, but as the head of a criminal conspiracy. They didn't care about his reputation on the block. They cared about wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. They hit him with a tidal wave of irrefutable evidence, bank statements, phone records, and a detailed map of his entire empire, all courtesy of a terrified Riggs, who was already being quietly moved into protective custody. The final takedown happened during the noon count, in the cold light of day. It was clinical, quiet, and utterly brutal. 2 state investigators, flanked by our own guards, who were now looking at me with a new, deeply confused respect, walked onto C Block. They walked past the other cells without a glance and stopped directly in front of Marcus's. "Inmate Thorne," the lead investigator said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "You are being transferred. Pending federal indictment." Marcus just stared, his face a frozen mask of pure disbelief. He looked around for his crew, for Riggs, for the empire he commanded just hours before. But no one would meet his gaze. His loyal lieutenants suddenly found the scuffed concrete floor utterly fascinating. The other inmates, the men he had terrorized for years, just watched, their faces impassive. His power had never been real. It was an illusion built on fear, and the spell had been irrevocably broken. They cuffed him and walked him out. As they passed my station by the central desk, he stopped and locked his eyes with mine. The arrogant sneer was gone. In its place was a dawning, horrified comprehension. He didn't know how I had done it. He couldn't possibly trace the steps. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that I had. The king had been checkmated by a piece he never even considered a player in the game. He had played checkers, a game of brute force. I had played chess. Later that afternoon, Warden Connolly called me into his office. He was pale, his hands trembling slightly. The state investigators had given him the broad strokes, and he was looking at me as if he were seeing a complete stranger for the first time. "Rostova," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The state boys. They told me the tip-off was so precise, so detailed, it had to have come from someone on the inside. Someone who saw everything." He leaned forward, his eyes wide with a terrifying new understanding. "That whole scene in the Chow Hall, you taking the abuse, the insults, you let it happen, didn't you? You used it. You baited him into underestimating you. I just stood there in the silent office. I didn't confirm or deny anything. I let him connect the pieces himself." "My God, Elena!" he breathed, slumping back into his leather chair as if his bones had turned to dust. "You dismantled a 20-year-old criminal enterprise without filing a single incident report. You played him. You played all of us." He was staring in stunned awe at the woman they called Sloppy Elena, the laughingstock of C Block, and finally seeing the Grandmaster who had just won a war no one else even knew was being fought. With Marcus Thorne gone, a power vacuum opened up on C Block. But it wasn't filled with the expected explosion of violence and chaos. It was filled with a strange, unnerving, and profound quiet. The entire ecosystem had been reset. The predators were confused, their leader decapitated by an invisible blade. The prey were no longer quite so scared. Order had been restored not with batons and riot shields, but with information and strategy. Riggs, in exchange for his full cooperation, was transferred to a low-security medical facility much closer to the hospital where his son, thanks to a single quiet phone call from my sister-in-law, was now enrolled in the clinical trial. He got a second chance to be a father. The kid, Peterson, and the dozens of other extorted inmates were finally safe. I never spoke a word of what I had done. To the other guards, I was just the officer who got lucky, the one who happened to be on watch when the state finally decided to clean house. To the inmates, I became something else entirely. They stopped calling me Sloppy Elena. In fact, they hardly spoke to me at all anymore. But when I walked the tiers, the looks of contempt were gone, replaced by something far deeper, a wary, cautious respect, heavily tinged with fear. They didn't know what I had done, but they knew I was the one left standing after the king had been swept from the board. But here is the secret that I have held on to, the one truth that no one, not even Warden Connolly, ever figured out. My goal was never justice. Justice is a concept for the world outside these walls. In here, there is only power. The anonymous letter I sent didn't just target Marcus. It was carefully crafted to take out his most loyal inner circle while leaving his core infrastructure, the mid-level dealers and enforcers I knew I could control, completely untouched. I didn't burn his empire to the ground. I seized it. The new quiet on C-Block isn't peace. It's the sound of 200 men holding their breath, waiting for their new queen to issue her first command. Marcus Thorne thought he could humiliate me. Instead, he gave me the perfect camouflage. He tried to make me a joke, and in doing so, he made himself a stepping stone. He learned the hard way that in a world run by brutes, the ultimate weapon isn't force. It's intelligence. And true power isn't about being the loudest man in the room. It's about being the quiet woman no one sees coming. Thank you for listening to my story. Please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, leave your like, and share this video with others.